Recording. When we talked about Munch's work, we were talking about the connections between his work and symbolist works. The idea of the femme fatale, for example, this spiritual interest, this interest in emotional qualities comes out of symbolism. The idea of embracing darker themes, right? Not really looking judgmentally at evil comes out of symbolism as well. Katie Kollwitz, less to do with the symbolist movement, but expressionism as a norm kind of does have a lot to do with that. And her, both of these obviously, very angst-ridden, typical for expressionism, but hers very mournful, very much influenced by the fact that her husband was a doctor. She had seen a lot of pain and suffering, parents bringing their children in, et cetera, et cetera. And then later in her life, during the war, lost her own son. So even though that doesn't affect this particular work, it certainly seems very prescient in her work. So expressionism is this sort of interest in not only expressive drawing, right, very expressive line quality, and sometimes a somewhat deformed physicality to bring out the expressive characteristics, but also very emotionally charged imagery, right? Are two sort of hallmarks of expressionism. We're going to shift our focus to the city of Dresden. Unlike France, where it's really, there's Paris and that's it, as an art center, right? People escape from Paris like Gauguin, but for the norm, it's just Paris. Germany doesn't have a single art center. Berlin is certainly the most famous German city, but there are major artistic movements in at least two other cities that we'll look at. Dresden is one of them. This is home to Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Kirchner is an interesting figure because he trained as an engineer. He went to school to become an engineer. And he had absolutely no training in drawing whatsoever. Right? No academic, artistic training. He was just going to be an engineer, right? And I don't mean railroads, right? Statics and whatnot. But he's not architecture, not an architectural engineer, right? Just an engineer. And then he decided to try drawing. And on a certain level, he turns his lack of training into, he wants to exploit that. And that really becomes the basis for his style, is the fact that he never had training. He didn't take life drawing classes. He didn't take classes in how to properly mix your oil paints or traditional ways of applying those paints to the surface. No classes in perspective, right? He really is kind of an outsider artist, if you will, outside of the academy. And he tries to capitalize on his lack of training. Trying to remain clumsy, trying to make his works look unsophisticated. Even, he said, primitive. Now, these two paintings are opposite sides of the same canvas. He did that a lot. Just turn the canvas over and paint it on the back of it, right? So if you ever go to the National Gallery, I have never seen it with the one on the right showing. Okay, I've only ever seen the one on the left, but they are opposite sides of the exact same piece of fabric, right? And they're fairly large. They're 6 feet tall, right? So the figures are life size or even a little bit bigger. Knowing that Kirchner wasn't trained traditionally, and knowing that he actually tried to embrace his lack of training and capitalize on it and turn it into his own personal style. Look at these two things and tell me, is there anything that just strikes you as being extraordinarily awkward about the works that you'd like to sort of point out? David?
The one on the right.
Yeah, the yellow one?
Yeah, the bottom half of her body is like facing, it's like the backside, but from the waist up, it's looks like the front.
It looks like the front, doesn't it? So it almost looks as if he's turned it at the waist, or like like Linda Blair's head in The Exorcist, but just at the waist as opposed to the neck, right? It's spun around, even though she doesn't have breasts that you can see. So it does kind of look like there's an amalgam of front and back views. But yeah, the arms are wrong for that view, right? There's no way you can do that with your back to you, right? Without hurting yourself, right? So that's one thing definitely that is there. That is very awkward. At the same time, the placement of the feet kind of works pretty well, the foot up and whatnot, right? Dina, was that what you were going to point to as well?
Yeah. Like what David said, it's like one part is backwards, the other is forwards, and that kind of makes an illusion or abstract image, and it can confuse the viewer.
Right, it is. And I think that's an important point, is that one of the things that Kirchner wants to do, and he says this in his writings, all these people wrote about what they're, right? He wants to confuse you. He wants to sort of kick you out of your comfort zone. You know what I mean? And you honestly, on a certain level, you might even spend more time looking at it, trying to figure it out, right? Because it's so strange. But it certainly is not, the image is not what you might see in the world around you. What about the one on the left? I mean, if these weren't on the back side of the same picture, you might even think they were by different artists because the paint application is so different, right? The one on the right is a very thin paint application, right? Washy almost. One on the left is incredibly thick, right? And I've got some details of the one on the left because I've seen that one, right? That I can show you. But what about the one, is there anything about that seems particularly strange or awkward? Or even just expressive, perhaps? Eleanor? The colors, right? The colors are pretty extraordinary, aren't they? Especially all those aqua blues and greens, right? They're incredibly vibrant throughout, and they're even made more vibrant by the fact that he's done this thing that, you often putting color opposites immediately adjacent to each other, right? So you got these hot oranges next to these lime greens, right? And these almost magenta purples, reds, next to some of these aqua blues, right? It's kind of almost hurts to look at. And I kind of like Kirchner, but at the same time, I kind of don't, if that makes sense, right? I like talking about him. I like the ideas he's dealing with, but I don't think I'd ever want one of these in my house, just simply because I think he's trying to make it difficult. That's exactly what Dina said, right? He's consciously trying to make it hard to look at. And that idea of making an art that challenges the viewer's sense of what is beautiful, right, is kind of an interesting idea. What is the rule that says that art has to be beautiful? Where's that written? We presume that to be the case, but art doesn't necessarily, that's not a cardinal rule. It doesn't have to be beautiful. Ideally, art should make you think twice about what you're looking at, but beauty is just one way to get there. And going all the way back to the late 18th century, where there was this idea that there are other kinds of memorable, formidable visual experiences that aren't pleasant, but that are memorable. Car wrecks, things like that, right? That are these visuals, they have an impact, right? And in the Romantic period, right, during the Enlightenment, they called this sublime, right? This deeply memorable visual experience, good or bad, right, that had such a strong impact on your emotions and remained for that reason unforgettable. And with Kirchner and with Expressionism, I think that there's something to be said for a sort of modern romantic idea of sublime art. Art that is so extraordinarily difficult, both in subject matter and in style, that it's almost impossible to forget. This was coming up here, right? He's definitely been looking around. We know this, right? That he's been looking at other art, even though as he writes about his works, he tends to play that down. Most artists do. It's a cocky thing to do, right? I'm not influenced by anybody, right? But he'd been looking around, and both works, the woman in yellow on the right and the pair on the left, are definitely intended to be prostitutes in the boudoir. So on the left, in the actual room where you would go in, where we would be with the demoiselles, the young ladies of Avignon, right, where they're showing us themselves and we're choosing our course for the evening, right? Like a better word. On the right, behind the scenes, which is kind of interesting because it's behind the picture as well, where she's washing up between customers, which was also a long-standing theme in French art. Degas did 100 of them, right? But there I brought in a Toulouse-Lautrec from the National Gallery, which is the Rue des Moulins is a famous house of prostitution, and they are being checked by the government authorities to make sure they're clean, right? So they're hiking up their skirts, and the same sort of lurid colors that we find often in Toulouse-Lautrec's work. Kirchner picks up on as well, right? As this theme of prostitution. I don't know what to do with this, right? Every time, almost throughout the history of modern art, we see so many pictures that when they're really trying to do something outlandish and new with the style, they'll do images of prostitutes, like Picasso. Like, if you remember from any 19th century class, you might have had Manet with Olympia. And I don't know what the connection there is. Why do they think this? Oh, I know, I got an idea. I'm going to shake everybody up, and I'm going to do it with a picture of prostitution. Please do that. Right. Well, here's some details of the paint application, and you can see how thick it is. And this is kind of fascinating with Kirchner. Look at the layers upon layers, right? He's worked on this for a long time because a lot of it is coming back over already dried paint, right? With more layers of paint. So he's not done, he's building it up slowly. And if you know oil paint, it takes a while to dry. And you can see that a lot of it seems to have been done either with a palette knife. Do you know what a palette knife is? Those people who don't do studio, right? It's the little thing you mix your paint with on the palette, right? It sort of looks like a trowel, but smaller, right? And he's painted a lot of this with the tip of the palette knife, right? So these bits of blue here, for example, have been sort of spoofed on with the palette knife, where other sections look like you might have just come out and squeezed the paint right onto the canvas, right? And maybe even come back with his fingers or something. It's really untraditional, not only in the color choice, but how he's laying the paint down. And sometimes it gets ugly, right? Again, this idea of paint, a painting that's consciously ugly. And for Kirchner, I think he knows he's not that good. I mean, not that trained, right? And he's going to turn that weakness into a strength, right? There we go. At certain points, and there are those dabs of blue right in the carpet. And again, I think he's got the tube of paint. He's going pour with the. That's spelled P-W-O-R-P. Pour. Across the canvas to get this section of the rug. And at a certain point, if we look at the foot, right, he's gone right over the top of the toes with exactly the same color. And when you look at it in this detail, it just becomes, it's so hard to look at. It reminds me of my sister's posters when I was a kid, right? I was born in 1960, so when I was like 12, my sister was 14, 72, 74, those blacklight posters, right? And she had her whole room covered with these things and got Dad to paint her room black, right? And had only a black light in there. And it's just, you walk in and, right? You just want to throw up from this overbearing colors. Kirchner's got those, without the black light. And it is awkward also in, the way the carpet tips down so steeply and her feet just don't work really well, right? They're almost like she's walking on her heels or something, right? These are his conscious awkwardness that's coming out in his work, right? One of his most famous works is this rather large picture up at MoMA. Hey, speaking of MoMA, I'm just going to plant a seed here. Fashion Club is thinking about renting a bus to go to New York for the day. And it would mean like leaving at 5 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning and getting back at like 9 at night. But we could piggyback with them and go to MoMA. Just plant that seed. The problem with MoMA is they don't let me talk to you. I can't even lean over and say something at MoMA. They, shh, no lecturing, right? So we'd have to figure out something that way. But so many of the works that we're looking at are in the Museum of Modern Art that if you're interested, we might try to get some seats on the bus. And I'd be willing to take the Saturday and do that, right? So I'll keep you posted, but just plant that seed for now, right? Pester me if you're interested. Okay, the street in Dresden on the right from the Museum of Modern Art. Also, again, God, those colors, right? A, they're so unnatural. And B, they're so jarringly juxtaposed with each other. So, can you read the picture okay? It's a little difficult to sort of figure out what's going on here, but can you see? So this is a fashionable shopping street, and we're seeing both sides of the street, either sidewalk. So on the left, in the upper left corner, is the left sidewalk if we were in the middle of the street. On the right-hand side, the right-hand sidewalk, and you can see those plunging perspective lines. There's one in the middle of the street, one off to the left. That is the middle of the street, and there's a trolley car that has just gone by, okay? But it's an otherwise pedestrian street, okay? So you might imagine there's very little car traffic on this street. And it's the sort of idea that the people parted for the trolley car and are kind of beginning to float back and cross the street after the car's gone by, right? And as you read it, of course, the street is this extraordinary pink, right? Just, I mean, absolutely, I don't know, not my favorite color, but very, very super saturated pink. And you'll notice as you look at it that certain areas, like around, see the little girl with that amazing hat around the top of her head? It almost looks like a black halo. But notice how the pink around it has been painted afterwards. Part of me thinks, okay, Cezanne did it and I loved it, and Kirchner does it and I hate it. You know, so how's that fair? Well, it's not, right? But the bit down at the bottom between the woman in chiffon yellow and the man in the pinstripes. Look at the area of sidewalk between the two of them. And all of a sudden it starts to look like a lava lamp, you know, like The Blob. In fact, this is the color of, you ever seen that movie, Steve McQueen, the 1958 horror film, The Blob? This is the color of The Blob, right? And then the colors he chooses for everything else, right? The face of the woman that's closest to us is red. The woman behind her is green with red around her eyes. The hands, they're both picking up their skirts as they walk, right? Because they've got the petticoats and everything underneath. And you can see the feet kicking out of her. But those hands are just these horrifying demon claws, right? One clutching a purse, and the other one becomes this sort of hook that's grabbing onto her blue dress to hike it up. The woman in red, just so uncomfortable in the way she's walking, right? And speaking of discomfort, what about those shots of lime green immediately adjacent to the red blouse, right? These are the sorts of things that just make you, I hope you're not prone to migraines, right? This is migraine-inducing, right? And all of this is his awkwardness. He's really never got the right training. It's not like he's, you know, like Picasso when he moved to analytic cubism, right? We saw he could draw, you know? He understood three-dimensional space, and he's really turning his back on that. For Kirchner, it's more that he's exploiting, right? He's turning his lemons into lemonade, as they say, right? And I've got some details. And you can see, look at her hat. Look at how often he's taken that tube of pink paint and he's squeezed it right onto the surface. So the lines that you see around here, right? Not only are they just kind of strangely awkward and not really trying to follow any kind of contour of anything, but they're squeezed directly out of the tube. And the more you look, the more you see the different areas of color that are just jarring to your eye. And it's nothing if not expressive, right? It certainly fits with what we were talking about. This is what makes expressionism. The V-neck of her blouse looks as if it's been rubbed on there, maybe with his thumb, or even the heel of his hand, because this is such a large picture. And areas have been gone over, so some of the green's been squeezed out of the tube directly adjacent to the pink in her hat on the left-hand side, right? It really is consciously trying to be primitive consciously trying to be awkward. There we go. Our little girl, that's like something out of a horror film, isn't it? This is like Chucky. It's just like, yeah, run away. And she's got this, and it's meant to be cute because she's got a little pinwheel, right? That thing in her hand is, one of those things you put up in the air and it goes, right? Blows in the air. You know what a pinwheel is, right? Okay. I don't know, because my references are always so shot, I'm old now. But also, you see, it's almost as if Jackson Pollock, he's dripped the paint on there. Right? This line of paint here. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. This is 1908, right? He may have reworked it in 1917, but it's extraordinarily groundbreaking when it comes to the traditions of art, right? He's really pushing it. Again, we're pretty sure that the women are prostitutes walking the street. And part of the reason for that is this green-faced guy that is quite obviously checking out the merchandise, right? And I never thought at first that this was as much about just like ugly male behavior as it was about prostitution until I was reading some stuff that that MoMA has published, and they're pretty sure. So given that they live with the picture, I'll take their word on that, right? And that the fellows that we see, both him and the man who's cut off by the side of the frame, looking over sort of askance to his right, are watching every movement of the women with the idea that the women are walking this shopping street in order to be picked up, right? That it's a fairly lurid picture. Now, this idea of making an art that is consciously primitive, consciously awkward, jars you out of your expectations, traditional expectations about art, was the primary agenda of a group of artists that Kirchner gathered together. They wrote a manifesto. They worked particularly close to each other. They would travel together to museums, right? They were a very, very tight-knit group, and they were called the Bridge, or in German, Die Brücke, right? The Bridge. And this was formed in 1905 by Kirchner and other artists in Dresden. And in their manifesto, they talk about this self-consciously clumsy, self-consciously primitive approach to art. Right? And they took their ideas from the famous late 19th, early 20th century philosopher Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Have you ever heard of him before? Yeah? A few times? Also sprach Zarathustra. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Right? Also sprach Zarathustra. And Nietzsche's book on Zarathustra, you know who Zarathustra is? You know what that, has anybody taken this in a philosophy or literature class? Also sprach Zarathustra. Anything about that? Who Zarathustra was and what did he say? Thus spoke Zarathustra. It's primitivism. Zarathustra was a deity before Christianity in the ancient Near East, right? Ancient Persia, known as Zoroaster or Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra, Zoroaster. Okay? And it's one of the first. It has certain parallels to Christianity, which came later. There's a god of light and a god of darkness, right? And the god-devil thing sort of parallels that, right? And what Nietzsche uses when he talks about, Zarathustra is the god of light, right? And when Nietzsche talks about Zarathustra and this primitive god of light, he talks about it and its relationship to human evolution. And what Nietzsche says is that human evolution is an ongoing process. It's a continuum, right? It's not something that happened before and is done, right? So it's based sort of on Darwin. But the idea of us having evolved from primitive to modern, we shouldn't think that the game is over. But in fact, that evolution will continue. And as we began as primitive apes and we've gotten now to modern man, we should expect that we will continue evolving from this point forward to become what Nietzsche called supermen. Right? There will be a next step of evolution will be to be beyond men. Superman. And this is where the word Superman came from, right? Way before DC Comics, Simon and Schuster, right? Came out of this. And his word for that, I think I have it on the slide, Übermensch. Means Superman, right? The Übermen. Übermensch, right? We will become supermen, right? We will continue to evolve. So modern man is not the end result. Modern man is the midpoint. Now, how do we get there? According to Nietzsche, right? We have to cross that bridge. Aha, the bridge, right? Nietzsche talks about the steps of evolution as bridges, right? And the bridge, in order to bridge from modern man to the race of supermen, we have to recognize that there is a bridge to our primitive past. That only when we acknowledge how far we've come can we then acknowledge how far we have yet to go. And that even though, when we understand the bridge to the past, and we look at how far we've come, we should realize that there's still a lot of that primitivism still here. Right? Recognize the primitive in the modern world. That will help us to understand that bridge backwards. Once we get there, we can start to abandon more of it and take a step across the bridge forwards. Right? Does that make sense? That's about as simple as I can lay it out, right? Have to think back in order to move forward. And what what Kirchner's work is doing is showing us the primitive in the modern. Helping us to understand the bridge to a primal, awkward, chaotic, primitive past so that we can make the step forward. Right? So that we can achieve our destiny. Right? It's all very complicated. Right? But Kirchner is deeply steeped in Nietzschean philosophy. So was Hitler. Right? He tried to make that bridge forward by programming the Aryan race, right? That was his idea of the next race of supermen. Yeah? Nietzsche's a problematic philosopher this way. Okay? So the bridge, as formed by Kirchner and seen through his works, is this twofold bridges. One back to the primitive past, that comes through his style, so that we are now kicked out of our normalcy, kicked out of our comfort zone, and then can, on our own, step forward. Right? This is. Did anybody ever see 2001? The sci-fi film from Go see 2001. It's a great art club. It's all about Nietzsche. It starts off with monkeys in Africa, prehistoric monkeys. They evolve to become modern, and then those people go into space and they evolve to the next step. Right? Everybody was confused in 1968. Now it makes all sorts of sense. And the theme song is Also Sprach Zarathustra by Strauss. Right? Right? I used to have slides of it, but now I realize nobody sees these things but me. He is obviously deeply influenced by Matisse. And even though we've already seen that Kirchner's been looking at Toulouse-Lautrec, we've probably been looking at Gauguin, but definitely Matisse. And he hated the comparison. And that kind of makes an interesting comparison because Matisse, he spoke about what he was trying to do with color. And whether you agree with him or not, I mean, these are so similar in color palette, aren't they? But remember what Matisse said he was trying to do, was he was trying to use color to give us an antidote to the modern world and a comfortable armchair in which to relax. Right? And for Kirchner, an antidote to the modern world is an uncomfortable world that we can then evolve out of. Right? So Matisse is a touchstone for Kirchner insofar as the color choices, right? but the ideas behind their works, what they're trying to achieve with their paintings, couldn't be more different. Interesting story. Everybody said, gosh, your guy's stuff looks like Matisse. And he goes, no, we predated Matisse. And he went back and he rewrote the history of the bridge. And he wrote their founding date to be before Matisse, right? And we all know that's not true, right? And he even went back and antedated some of his paintings, like painted over it and changed the date to something earlier so it would look like he was innovative instead of following the ideas of Matisse. He's a cocky SOB, Kirchner is. And part of me thinks, well, good for you, I guess. You got to kind of have something going, some chutzpah if you're going to be a professional artist, right? You've got to have something out there that says, I think I'm great. He certainly does think he's great as well. So Matisse is a strong influence on his works. Let's see what happens here because those gray lines at the top bother me. Hey, look, I got pictures. Two more Kirchners where we can see from local collections how he develops as an artist, how he continues to work these ideas in Dresden that are obviously indebted to the Fauves, but again, using them in a fashion that's meant to make us look twice at our world. For my money, the dance hall, the Bellevue dance hall picture on the left is perhaps one of the nicest things he ever did. It's almost attractive, right? Which for Kirchner is a rarity, right? But still some of the same colors. And then there's our pink from the Dresden street scene reappearing in the sky on the right in the flower beds picture, where everything seems it's like a lake of fire, isn't it? I mean, it looks like those photos that we saw this summer of the lava flowing in Hawaii, you know. Everything looks as if it's just simply erupting with these colors. And again, they're so jarring and so lurid during this period. This is, again, typical for Kirchner and for other artists we'll see in the bridge movement. Finally, again, from the Dresden period, from the National Gallery, a relatively recent acquisition of these two women under a parasol, where we can see, again, the awkwardness with the human figure, the strange proportions of the faces. You probably would recognize the one with the umbrella, the pink one. Her face very similar to the women on the street in Dresden, right? The one on the left a little bit less so, but looking clumsy. Is actually a nice way of putting it. And the body shapes also equally clumsy. One wonders with the breast of the one on the left, the orange figure, or some of the angularity. If he'd been looking at Picasso and the young ladies of Avignon, he'd say no, right? But there's every chance that he's been picking up on that as well. One other thing to mention as Kirchner is trying to push his art backwards, right? I mean, consciously, that's kind of what he's trying to do. He's pushing the style backwards, right? Is that he begins to look at other earlier art and channel some of those ideas into his paintings. And so in particular for him, and actually for a lot of expressionist artists, German Renaissance prints become an amazing sort of wealth of visual information for them. So when we looked at what's her name? Beginning of class. Katie Kollwitz. We were talking about how she had been looking back at Dance of Death woodcuts by Holbein or images by Rembrandt in printmaking. Kirchner, this angularity of the figures and the strength, the brutal strength of the outline of the forms, and sometimes the odd and expressive changes to proportions. A lot of these can be found in early German woodcuts. And they too, because they're often very small, they're like the ones on the right are about like this, maybe, right? About the size of a deck of cards, or maybe even a little bit smaller. They have to be carved somewhat brutally, you know, because they're so small. And so these woodcuts, so you're carving away all of the white spaces here, and they're hand-tinted for the colors, right? Often hand-tinted for the colors. Have that sort of primitive awkwardness to the proportions of the figures, a strongly assertive gestural quality, not only to the lines themselves, but also to the movements and the actions of the figures, and a certain simplifying and flatness. These things all come out of earlier German prints, and Kirchner's picking up on that. Right? So these things are helping him make a consciously primitive art. And it should be noted that 15th century painting, especially in Northern Europe, was referred to by historians in the early part of the 20th century as the primitives. We would call these German primitives, right? And that's how Kirchner would have known of them, as German primitives. In the same, they would have called Van Eyck a Flemish primitive, even though he's so sophisticated. Well, he's got a number of people in the group with him. Erich Heckel is part of this group, another founding member of the Bridge movement. And you wouldn't mistake him for a Kirchner in that the color palette is very, very different, significantly more naturalistic. But what does it share? That vigor, right? The expressiveness of the stroke, the mark making, as Sarah likes to say in her drawing classes, is what sets this apart as being so strongly expressive. And again, like Kirchner, he's taking a chance and breaking the rules. Okay, come on. There we go. Lots of the sky is bare canvas to be seen between the strokes, and the vast majority of the strokes are, I think you can tell, applied with the palette knife. Simply scraped across, right? So he's picking up the paint, he's sort of pulling the brush out of the equation, mixing the paint on the palette, and then just going in and scraping it onto the top of the canvas. And again, not necessarily working the canvas the way that people had traditionally been instructed to, even though Heckel had legitimate training, right? One more detail of this, right? So you can see the way in which the colors, and again, often wet and wet, have been worked on this, and how you can see areas where he's picked up, for example, must have a significant amount of that paint on the palette, and kind of comes all over the place with it, right down here, and then throughout the rest of the sky, oranges coming over the top of it. There's something about a fury almost with how they paint. You can almost imagine it, the artist just attacking it, with the palette knife as he's working. Another of the early members of the Bridge, he joined in 1906, the second year, Emil Nolde, one of the better knowns. He didn't last very long with them. He only stayed with them for about a year. So this is after he left the movement, but his works still remain very much primitive in the same way that share that primitivism with Heckel and with Kirchner. Also, the idea of children is a great metaphor, subject matter to choose if you're trying to make works of art that are consciously primitive. Then childhood is a great sort of well to tap, right? Because in childhood, things are simple. We are not sophisticated yet, or as we'd like to think we're not as sophisticated yet, right? Life is simple. We play, right? And if you're an artist as a child, children's art is fascinating to look at because there's something about it that's so primal. It's tapping into something that is, some sort of shared understanding of humanity that hasn't yet been driven out by your education, And so I think with our subject matter here of the round dance, we can see it as fitting in with what the Bridge was trying to do, achieve something significantly more primitive. In this case, the canvas isn't even primed. It doesn't even have a layer of gesso on it. And so in the sky, you can see these brown parts of the canvas, a conservator's nightmare. Because once that oil seeps in, it just makes the canvas rot, right? And so, again, that's that idea of primitivism, right? Trying to make a work of art that is ostensibly primitive in every possible way, not only in how it's painted, but again, also, I think, subject matter. Here's Olivia's work for your term paper. right? Another member, Max Pechstein, who joined the bridge in 1906. He stayed very, very close. Nolde and Pechstein sort of joined at the same time. And Nolde left the group almost right away, within a year, probably because Kirchner's kind of a jerk. But Pechstein and Kirchner remained pretty close throughout the rest of their career. And you can see that his kind of painting, the color choices that he makes, are significantly closer to Kirchner's than either Haeckel or Nolde that we just looked at, right? That he all returns to these jarring, super saturated primary and secondary colors, right? Somewhat more realistic in that his sky is actually blue, but at the same time, the ground has that lava lamp quality, right? Being nothing but these colors that aren't necessarily based entirely on observation. Although since it's a summer day, who's to say if he's not trying to capture some of the expression of the fall of sunlight on fields at the end of the summer in particular when grass turns brown. And there are some days, we've seen them here, when the world does seem like it's all yellow and red, because it's so revoltingly hot outside. Certainly, Pechstein's picking up on various themes that also suggest he knows Matisse, other French artists like Cézanne, the idea of the bathing in the middle of the day as a theme, sort of a golden age, right, that he's trying to revert back to. And I think we'll talk about that in a second, because I wanted to mention something here. In 1908, both Pechstein and Kirchner left Dresden and moved to Berlin, right? And this was more or less kind of the breakup of the group, yeah? And I think I might have cut a slide out here, but this would make a wonderful comparison to write an essay about this versus either of those Matisses, like The Joy of Life or Luxe, Calme et Volupté, right? Either of those two works that are ostensibly the exact same theme, bathers enjoying a sort of back to nature moment, but toward what end, right? And for the bridge, that idea of evoking a golden age, right, unspoiled by modern progress, that fits their agenda of making an art that makes us aware of where we came from so that we can move forward. And that where we came from can be childhood, it can be primitive nature, a golden age where we are in harmony with nature, right? These are all possibilities. Kirchner, after moving to Berlin, gets slightly more cubist in his outlook, in his approach to the works of art. So here we have ostensibly the same scene we saw before when we looked at the street in Dresden, right? Women, finely dressed, walking down a lurid pink sidewalk, right? Street on the left with people on the opposite side, a vehicle moving through. In this case, it's a motor car rather than a tram, right? No creepy little girl, right? But what we have, of course, are men around them in hats. And the fellow on the right appears to be window shopping, right? Not interested, but looking into the blue off to your right. But look what he's doing with his cane, right? He's consciously trying to slow them down, trip them up a bit, make them pay attention to him as the first foray into their arrangement, into their deal. But again, these are prostitutes. And definitely he's been looking at Cubism. And this is why, on a certain level, we refer to Cubism as the Cubist Revolution. Because once Picasso and Braque go here, right, beginning in 07 and taking off after 1909, 1910, we find almost every artist everywhere, at least every art movement everywhere, responding to that in some way because it's such a radical new way of looking. And so Kirchner's earliest stuff is significantly less angular than what we see after 1911, right? After Cubism, he picks up on those ideas. But again, we have to go over the other stuff, the color juxtapositions, the awkward anatomies, right? He's been painting now for, almost 10 years. He's getting better. I'll give him that, right? Things are fitting together better. But he still is using that awkwardness sort of intentionally, right? The blue, pink, and orange in the left corner. Again, not easy to look at, right? They're not your normal color combos that you tend to want to see, but they are Picasso's, aren't they? It makes a nice comparison that way. Otto Müller joined up with the group in Berlin. He was invited to join by Pechstein. Also, as you can see, very much influenced by Cubism, with those angular figures and how the forest in the background seems to occupy as much solidity as the human figures in the foreground. All of that coming out of Cubism. They say the same about the Kirchner on your left, right? So this is all the bridge, right? These different groups of figures. Müller, like the other bridge artists, very much influenced by German printmaking, right? This is such a keystone for our expressionist artists. Really, all of them are early German prints. And I don't know which ones he knows, so I just grabbed what's local, right? What you can see around the area. Here is another hand-printed or hand-colored print of the Madonna in this rose garden. Little Jesus there with the dove in his hand. I want you to look at the body of Jesus and look at how the knees articulate and how the body is handled. It's a series of very rough, heavy outlines. And then flip your eyes over to Müller. Right? Look at the angularity of the scarf around the Virgin Mary's head. How the folds fall in these sort of sharp angles. And then flip your eye back over to the Müller. And even though the Müller piece is about 5 or 6 feet tall, it's really quite large, right? He's channeling these small German prints into his final work. And then as I was putting this together, right, I don't know what to say about this other than I was flipping through it, I was thinking German prints, and I was looking through the National Gallery website to find good pictures to show you. And all of a sudden, I saw this Dürer print. Look at the couple on the right of the Müller. And look at Adam and Eve in this print by Dürer. Now, Dürer is much more sophisticated, right? Much more rounded. It doesn't have that angularity of those really early German prints. But that made me just wonder if Müller knew this print or not. I'd do some research into that. It makes sense that he might have if he's been looking at old German prints. And then, if that's the case, does that mean that his bathers are a particular kind of golden age, right? The Pechstein bathers, right? Olivia's work. The Pechstein bathers are definitely meant to be a sort of Matisse-ian golden age, right? Arcadia, where time stands still and progress doesn't interrupt our connection with nature. For Müller, is he giving an overlay of sort of the Garden of Eden to all of this? And if you think about what the bridge is all about, what they're trying to do with their art, make us understand the primitive within the modern. What better analogy than the Garden of Eden, right? The dawn of man, as Christianity tells it, right? Would be a perfect subject matter to choose to try to get these ideas across. So that makes me think that Müller might well have, right, lifted things from images of Adam and Eve, altered them so they're not so blatant and obvious, right, and incorporated them into his work to help with this idea that we are still primitive, something we have to know before we can move on to become Übermenschen, right? Supermen of the future. Come on, I'm trying to change the slide. There we go. Love Kandinsky. Adore Kandinsky. You know, when I was an undergrad, sitting where you are, I hated Kandinsky. I didn't get it. I thought it was too strange, too weird. I thought he didn't know what he was doing, and I had the anybody can do that mindset, right? It took me a long time. I was an immature undergrad. I've since figured it out now that I'm in my 50s. Kandinsky is active in a third city, right, which is in Munich, right? So we'll look at a very different strain of expressionism that exists around Kandinsky in the city of Munich. And one of the things about Kandinsky is that he is the artist who is usually credited in almost all of the literature on modern art. He's the one that people say is the first artist to make a non-representational work of art, a totally abstract work. Now, I said this before, that I'm not a big fan of who's the first and what's the biggest and what's the most expensive and all of that sort of stuff. There's other reasons to remember works of art than whether or not they were the first or the best or the biggest or the, worth the most. But suffice to say that Kandinsky is often said to be the one who broke through to the other side. And there's a famous story about Kandinsky coming home late to the studio. Had been out. And he looks on the floor and he sees a totally abstract work of art laying on the floor. And he's struck by the power of it because it doesn't represent anything. And he realizes that it's just one of his own pictures turned upside down so that he didn't recognize what it was. And that lack of recognition pushed him sort of over to the brink to understand the power of art that is not representational. We'll talk sort of what he's trying to do with that as we look at his works. So he's in Munich. This is our third major art city, right, in Germany, unlike Paris or France, where there's just Paris, right? And we've certainly seen other artists who are pushing it, right? Right around the same time, 1911, 1912, right in this time period, the Orphists, right, Delaunay and other Orphists are also pushing beyond representation. Right? Now, the title suggests that this is representational, that it's the sun and the moon, but the picture itself has gone pretty much abstract. Kandinsky takes that a step further in a way and gives us a title that has no explanatory role to play. Right? Like the Orphists, Kandinsky is interested in color and the power of color. We'll talk about that. He has very specific ideas about this. Right? So like Delaunay, he's interested in color. And like Kupka, he sees a connection between color and sound. And in particular, between color and music. Right? So there's a lot of overlap with the Orphists, who are right around this exact same time in Paris, with Kandinsky's work. Right? Again, it's impossible to say who's first, but Kandinsky's usually given the nod for being the first one to ever go this direction. Now, he wasn't always this way, if you will. He wasn't always entirely abstract. This is up at the Krieger Collection on Foxhall Road, up near American University. A rider on a path through some aspen trees, working its way back through the hills, right, on a piece of tinted green background that makes it entirely artificial. He's a Russian. Maybe his name tells you that. Sometimes you'll see his first name spelled with a V, right? Vasily Kandinsky. And sometimes with the W. But he'd moved to Munich as early as 1896, right? He'd been there for a while in Munich. In fact, he'd started an art group in Munich, the New German Artists Union, he called it. And he was the founding member of it. And they kicked him out when he started to make works like the one on the right, because it was too radical for even them, right? God, it's like a guy who gets kicked out of the band he started, right? Brian Jones with the Rolling Stones, right? Founded the Stones before Mick and Keith, and they kicked him out when his drug habit got too bad, right? Kandinsky got kicked out when his art habit got too bad, if you will, right? So he began using color in this sort of nondescriptive manner, right? The green here certainly does look like the fields and the hills, but at the same time it doesn't look like the sky. And he applies on top of that these dabs of color that aren't entirely representational. So the tree becomes these dabs of blue. The fields pick up the blue as well. And some of them may have roots in representation, but not all of them do. And it's certainly easy when we look at this to see all of the artists that he's sort of thinking about, that he's beginning to channel. A little bit of Van Gogh here, right? This is pre-Fauvism, so we can't really talk about Andre Derain, even though there's a similarity there, right? Makes you wonder about cross-fertilization. That tree, maybe a little Gustav Klimt, right? The Kiss, or Redon, right? Our symbolist artist Redon. The horse itself breaking down to a series of white strokes with a little bit of red for the reins, and a rider in blue on the horse making the corner. Somewhat more representational. But he's beginning to think about color as something more than just representation, more than just description, right? That the color for him is going to mean something else. And we'll find out as we look at his stuff what this is. The other thing to notice with his very early Krieger work on the left is the motifs he chooses. These are going to be very important for Kandinsky as well. As he develops toward abstraction, not only the colors that he chooses, in particular the blues, right? But also the motifs he chooses, the horse and rider in particular, are important and extraordinarily symbolic for him. He doesn't choose any color haphazardly. Every one of them has a resonance and a meaning for him. And the same holds true not only for representational objects like the horse and rider, but also when those objects become the basis for simple shapes in the abstract pictures. When he simplifies them, he thinks that they retain their original symbolism, even after having been translated into something abstract. So keep these things in the back of your mind. The colors that he's choosing, the motifs that he's working with. There's, this sounds bad, but I don't mean it this way, repetitiveness, right? A reworking of these ideas in picture after picture after picture. Easily the best collection of Kandinsky's, I think probably anywhere, is in the Guggenheim in New York. They're not always all out on display, but they have a phenomenal Kandinsky. So we're seeing a lot of Guggenheim pictures by Kandinsky. At least 8 different works in 1909, at least 8 different paintings in 1909 feature the horse and rider. Right? That's how important this theme is to him. Right? Horsemen everywhere. And they become the basis for the art movement that he founds in 1909, called the Blue Rider Group, or Der Blaue Reiter. Right? And you can see that the Krieger work, he is indeed a blue rider. But in the Blue Mountain on the right, there are riders in a picture with strong blue accents. Right? The Blue Rider Group. Now, the word Reiter in German not only means horseman or rider, but it also means soldier, cavalier, crusader, right? A man on horseback riding off to battle. And Kandinsky writes about these motifs. Right? And in fact, the Blue Rider Group had a journal. They had a sort of, I think it was quarterly publication that they filled with woodcuts, reproductions of paintings, black and white, right, because we don't have the color technology, poems that they themselves wrote, and works in prose, sometimes things like art theory, but also narrative stories, right, just filled with these things, right. Blue ink for us might, but they're a much more tight-knit group with shared philosophical ideas and agenda, okay? It's wonderful for us because we can find out tons of things about what they're interested in, right? You can find out because one of them was your artist, right, we will get to. So the Blue Rider Almanac, right? In the writings that Kandinsky, and he wrote significantly throughout his entire career, all the way to the 40s, he said the horsemen were a symbol for a crusade against tradition. And that he felt that his art, right? Art itself, the making of art, the looking at art, the interaction with art, was a spiritual activity. One that, at the end of the day, was in conflict with the physical world. That art should help us to win the battle for a more spiritual kind of existence. That's why he calls it a crusade, right? We tend to not like that term because of the racist stuff that comes out of it because of its use in the Middle Ages, right? But what he's seeing when he says the word crusade is this idea that what does a crusader do? Okay, on one hand, yes, he subjugates other religions to his own religion by force. That's not what he means by that, right? What he means is that what a crusader does is he fights for spiritual truth. And that his paintings, his role as a painter, is to fight for spiritual truth. Thus, for him, the horseman motif, right, is one absolutely indebted to this idea that art should battle against tradition, should battle for an increased sense of spirituality, maybe even redemption on the part of the viewer, in a not traditionally religious sense, right? So as he develops the horseman, right, he moves in this case, so we can read this okay? I mean, he's got these sort of Matisse colors, right? And the sky behind becomes an active, sort of solid in the center. But we have a yellowish tree on the left and an orange or reddish tree on the right, and the sky in the center. And we can read now pretty clearly our horsemen here, right? There's 1, 2, 3 of them at least, right? And they're wearing long robes, hoods, which makes them also look somewhat medieval, right? And there are more of them over here, right? That hipster knit hat, right? But here's a figure with what looks like almost like a Cossack hat on. Remember, he's Russian, right? And the horse is then moving off to the left and across the canvas as they move. As he began to develop the idea of the horseman, he began to work with this repeatedly. One of the things that he hit on were other places in literature and history where horsemen sort of entered into it, into the idea of getting rid of the world and moving to something more spiritual. And one of the themes that he hit on, in particular, was the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And so again, Dürer, who we looked at before, and how important early German printmaking is for the expressionists, right? So this one's done, impressions of this everywhere. It's a woodcut. Phenomenal. You've done woodcuts. Right?
We went down to the gallery, we actually saw it.
Yeah, it's pretty fantastic, right? Because he's carving away the whites, right? So you figure out how you do cross-hatching that way, right? Anyway, you can see the similarity in that as the horsemen move from left to right, right? And this happens in the Dürer as well. Right, so you know about the 4 horsemen, this is like Book of Revelation. The 4 horsemen are going to come before Jesus comes back at the end of time, right? That's the story. And each one of the horsemen, it's war, famine, disease, death. Thank you. Duh. Death. Each of the 4 of them are going to come out, and each one kills a 4th of mankind, right? So a 4th die from war, and that's the guy with the bow and arrow. No, from disease. Yeah. You get that. I forget which one. Except that death is obviously the one in the foreground, right? Right? So he's got only 3 of them here, but the idea is being picked up. This idea that it's the Book of Revelation, and what the 4 horsemen end up doing is they end up wiping out the physical world in order to prepare for the coming of a spiritual realm. Right? That's what the book of Revelation kind of sets up, right? Is that the world is wicked, needs to be wiped out in order to allow Christ's triumphal return. Right? So if we think about Kandinsky and his idea that the horseman relates to this idea of a quest for spiritual truth, right? A fight for redemption, a fight for spirituality, then the four horsemen of the apocalypse becomes a fascinating thing for him. Because what we'll see when we look at more of his works is that they often are about chaos that leads to peace and tranquility. Chaos that leads to order. That often including both of them in the same picture. So as Dürer has given us in the lower left corner, the mouth of hell, eating, in this case, a priest, right? Or is that a bishop down there, right? We have more figures in the lower left corner here, almost as if he's sort of channeled some of these traditional images of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? So these are ideas that he's working with as he works his way through the early stages when he's still representational. He also does landscapes of the area around Munich. Murnau is just outside of Munich. It's a little bit toward the Alps. Munich is very close to the Alps, right? And here is the Pompidou Center in Paris, another landscape, and it has the town of Murnau, clouds and sky, and the church tower. And you can see that thing that looks like a tall mushroom, right, on the left. That's the church tower in Murnau, right, this item here. So focusing on church architecture is another of his motifs that will continue even as he goes abstract, and that are meant to remind us of the spiritual in the world around us, right? And a way to transcend that to something else. A little bit easier to see here, and it's slightly more abstract. Again, this is the town of Murnau, and there is its church in the background now, looking like a bit of seaweed or something, right, with that bob on the top. And there's the church that it's based on, right? There's Murnau and its proximity to the Alps, right? So the church remains for him an incredibly strong motif, along with the horse and rider, that he will continue to work through as he moves in this early part of his career, trying to make an art that is spiritual. Okay? Now, around 1910, he starts to take these forms and he starts to simplify them. And he starts to rearrange them. Right? So, can we see things here that we've been looking at already? Can you find a horseman? Right in the middle. There's another one moving this way, right? A blue one. Blue rider, right? Going this way with the figure on its back. One moving this way with the figure on its back. Other figures standing behind it. Those figures down in the corner we've got right here. Right? The Murnau church tower has been made much more organic, and the top of it altered somewhat, but there it is. And you'll notice that the Murnau church tower now stands pretty much on the central axis, rather than off to the side. And the horses are also right there on the central axis. And the more that we spend time looking at this picture, the more we start to see other things that seem to have a basis in representation. That sort of Statue of Liberty figure in the lower left corner, right? With its arm up, coming out of some sort of egg-like form. A number of figures on the right, in red, one looking like a stick puppet, kind of, right, but carrying something. Another one, another hooded figure, something on the ground over there. Some green figures, very similar as well, and a pair of figures, it appears, recumbent, laying down. right, in white with yellowish caps or heads, right? And one of them seeming to rise up. I'm just now thinking this, I'll probably bring it in on the next class because we're almost out of time. Looks like a nativity scene almost, right? With the wise men bringing their gifts to Jesus and Mary, off to the right. Mountains up in the background. And then we look at the sky, right? The figure back here, right, with his arms out to the side, right? If we look at the sky, you'll notice it's almost like it's erupting, like it's exploding on the other side. Splashing out around on the left, exploding like thunder or lightning on the right, up above, right? But it is intended to be a landscape filled with figures. Might not recognize it first because what he's doing is he's taking these ideas he's been working with, right? The writer, the church, and he's simplifying them. He's stepping away from the perception of the physical world into something where it's not necessarily about the physical world anymore. That his paintings are doing what the four horsemen of the apocalypse did, right? They're slowly but surely, as a painter, he's wiping out the physical world. And just like the four horsemen of the apocalypse are setting up the salvation of mankind, right, for all time, he too is hoping that by wiping away the references to the physical world, slowly but surely, his works will make you focus on something else than the world around you. And what else is there? The spiritual world, right? It goes back to an age-old question that's plagued artists even into the Middle Ages. How can you make a representational art that is filled with spiritual values if the representational art simply reminds you of the physical world? That's a problem, right? It bothered the hell out of Michelangelo, right? Make these big muscular guys that are supposed to be filled with sort of spiritual truths. But at the same time, they remind us of the luxuries of the physical world. How can we make an art that focuses our attention on the metaphysical world instead of reminding us of the beauties of the world around us? And for Kandinsky, what we're seeing as he slowly proceeds toward abstraction is exactly a solution to that problem. Get rid of the references to the physical world so that only color and shape evoke Platonic ideas, right? Metaphysical ideas in your head. And he wrote about this. Right? What do the colors mean? What do the shapes mean? And he continued to write about it as his art developed. So, it's 4:45. We'll look at more Kandinsky on Friday. Well, I don't know what we're looking at on Friday because we're going to talk about the exam and what's going to show up online for the time that I'm gone and so forth, right? I'd like to continue talking about it. Maybe we'll look at a few more Kandinskys first just to get them out of the way, so to speak, to wrap this up so you don't have to wait 3 weeks to hear about it again, right?